child, the negotiation between the mom and the child, and it also took us 2 paragraphs to describe what was going on between the mom and the other adults present. No sign of interruption. And we think that that's an important part, again, of learning by observing and seeing what there is to see, be a part of things. Actually, I'll show you really quickly the distribution. So each of these bars, partly because I want to show you a case graph. We've invented case graphs, and I think it's a really good way to show variability as well as pattern, or in the pattern. Each of these is a mom in San Pedro, and the black part of the bar is simultaneous attention. And you can see that the mom in San Pedro who used the least amount of simultaneous attention is equivalent to the mom in Salt Lake who used the most. They're non-overlapping, almost non-overlapping distributions, which is rare in any social science research. When we look at the, we also put the toddlers in there, and you can see how much the San Pedro toddlers are using simultaneous attention, and how much more that is than the Salt Lake moms using simultaneous attention. What the moms in Salt Lake tended to do was alternating attention, which was a quick interruption of one thing by the other. Not losing track of the other activity, but briefly stopping one in order to attend to another. That was most common in Salt Lake. But there were times when the mom seemed to be unaware of something that we were convinced that she would have wanted to be aware of, judging on the basis of what she did at other moments in the videotape. So it looks to like a difference in cultural preference for how people use their attention. You have comments or questions?
How do you track the toddler's simultaneous attention?
Well, we had videotapes, and we looked at them like each little portion of a second, maybe 5 times, looking to see. So if the toddler, we have, in the case of this toddler here, she's operating a pencil box. We made it more difficult than usual to have a pencil box, so it would be hard for her to operate it. And we looked to see whether while she was operating the pencil box and she was attending to the adult conversation, whether she stopped doing anything that took some skill with the pencil box or seemed to zone out of the adult conversation. And we just looked for interruptions. And if we saw any interruption, we didn't consider it simultaneous attention. There's probably ways one could measure it in milliseconds with a more controlled in a more controlled setting. And that would be interesting to see if still down at the level of milliseconds, we would see a lack of interruption of one thing by another for the minor families. I don't know the answer to that. But did that answer what you were curious about? Anything else? Yeah.
How careful is this influential literature on multitasking and how people think they're better at multitasking than they actually are, and whether or not this is actually a beneficial thing for them to be doing?
Oh, that's a good question, and I should probably address that without being asked. Both simultaneous attention and alternating attention are forms of multitasking. I'll show you this little girl here. She's alternating attention, and what she does is I hand the mother an object, the mother hands it to the daughter who starts operating it. The mother simultaneously moves the cushion away with her foot. And the little girl lowers what she's been paying attention to, watching what the mother's doing with her foot, and then comes back to it. She doesn't lose track. She's doing 2 things at once, but with interruption. And, well, just to finish that thought, and then I'll show it to you. I think that most of what's been studied is multitasking. It's not simultaneous attention. Simultaneous attention is very skilled, and most of the populations that have been involved in those studies of multitasking are European American middle class. And so I don't think we've studied to be able to answer your question there. But let me show you the clip of the girl. see how she kind of lost it for a moment. Well, she didn't lose it. She just put it on hold for a moment and then came back to dealing with the object. So we followed that up with research with kids in Mexico and U.S. Mexican heritage kids and found the same basic pattern, that kids from backgrounds that are likely to be in touch with indigenous practices were more likely to use simultaneous attention than European heritage kids from families with a lot of schooling, or Mexican American kids whose families had a lot of schooling. And our reasons for being interested in that, quotes, middle group who have experience with both cultural systems is to see what happens to their attention, to their collaboration, and so on, when they have experience with both sets of practices. I realize that I think you ended 5:30, is that right? Okay. So I'll tell you just a little bit more and then general questions. We did a study, this is Mari Correa Chavez's dissertation study, looking at a situation that we devised in which the kids are present, but there's no obvious reason why they would need to be attending to what's going on around them. So, and we think that mirrors most of life for kids who are allowed to be present, but aren't told, you need to study this, you need to be helping me with that. They're there, they pitch in under their own steam, but nobody's telling them they need to. So the research assistant, Marta, is showing the older sister how to make the toy mouse that runs on an elastic band on the spool. And her little brother is over here. He's been told that in a few minutes he'll get a chance to make this blue origami, an origami jumping frog like the blue one on the table. And he's invited to sit over here. And he's told, you can play with this thing while you wait. And it's called a do-nothing toy. It's interesting at first, but not for long. And so we're interested in seeing the attention of the kid who's just waiting. There's no reason, he's not going to make a toy that's related to what she's making. He's very carefully seated at not facing them and at a precise distance. We had to do a lot of staging to get it just right so that they would feel, so the kids would not feel like they had to be watching, nor that they were excluded from watching. And having them at an angle that we could see when they're looking over there because they turn their heads, or even they pull up their chairs over that direction. But we made it hard for them to pull up their chairs because we put a piece of wood behind the chair so they could scoot very easily. So watch this little guy. It almost looks like a still picture, and unless you're noticing that he moves a little bit, and the other people are definitely moving. Contrast that with this little guy who's from Santa Cruz. Same situation. He is the younger brother.
Let's do this first. Leave of doubt. Stretch. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Now, next step.
And he sighs. He did look over at them momentarily. It seemed more like it was to see why they weren't paying attention to him being so clever, rather than him looking to see what they were doing to actually learn something about what they're doing. And when we look at the numbers for the number of families that we included, the children from the Maya traditional families, where there's 0 to 2 years of schooling, paid that kind of sustained attention for most of the time that they were in the room. The European American kids whose families had a lot of schooling were doing it half as much. more often they were paying no attention. The Mayan kids whose families had a lot of schooling were in between. And we invited the kids back. Well, when they finished making their toys, we said, we'll keep those here for you for a week until all the kids have had a chance to make their toys, and then you can come back and get them. And they came back individually, and when they came in, they got the toy that they had made, and then Marta said, oh, I have some extra materials for making the thing that your sister made last week. You want to make one? And the kids all wanted to make one. And so I showed you the clip earlier of the kid, the adult who was sitting back and the kid who was wanting some help. So the adult says, here's the materials. I have some reading to do or some crocheting to do, depending on which study we're recording on. And, but if you need help, let me know. And so we looked to see how much help the kids needed. And the Mayan kids from traditional families needed less help than either of the other two groups. So I think it's really hard to get a good measure of learning. I think there's, if we look across cultures and look at what people think is going on in a test situation, there's such differences that I think most of our studies of comparing cultural groups in learning, I don't put much faith in them. In this case, I think it was a pretty good way of finding out if they learned something from the opportunity that they were part of. And it seems that not only were the kids looking alert, but they were learning something from it. Yeah?
How are you assessing help? In which ways is help accounted for?
Yeah, the research assistant followed a script. There's, for one of the toys, there's 4 steps involved. One has 5 steps. And for each of those steps, there was a 5-point graded series of help. So, so you just count up the number of points. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Could that be attributed to the fact that they wanted to ask for less help in the Mayan families, and the Mayan students wanted to ask for less help because they wanted to impose less?
That's an interesting question. It could be, but I kind of think not, because the kids who she eventually would help them. And some of the kids, in order to get a lot of help, they had to have gotten stuck. So if they got stuck, she would help them. So, you know, along those steps. But I think there's a possibility that would make some difference in numbers. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you tried to control a couple of variables that came to mind. One is the size of the family, so the presence of siblings, and material resources, toys, for example. And on the one hand, I would be curious to know whether you could isolate and see if indeed there is something beyond the fact that they are accustomed to play together because they don't have multiple numbers of the same toy, and there are multiple siblings in the same household, or if it is indeed something that is beyond those kind of material demographic characteristics.
Okay. You might anticipate that I would kind of resist the idea that we can separate culture from how many siblings tend to be in a family, what kind of material things one is around. So I'll start by just resisting the idea that there's some, I'm not trying to find out about ethnic differences, I'm trying to talk about cultural experience, which includes how many siblings are in a family. Still, it's a reasonable question to say which aspects are kind of pushing things that way. In the study with the toddlers, we chose families that all had a toddler and a 3 to 5-year-old sibling. It doesn't entirely control for family size or number of siblings or sibling order, but it gets pretty far in that direction. And we found the same pattern for when we controlled for sibling size in that manner and when we didn't. So, and it didn't seem to vary according to how many other SIBs they had in one version of the study. We didn't control for having a 3 to 5-year-old sibling. I think that what may happen, is that if you're part of a cultural community where the norm is for there to be lots of people around and have large families, that it may be a good place to learn to be paying attention simultaneously. So, but it may not be based on how many siblings you have or how many children you have, depending on which argument you want to make there. Because some people say, well, the mothers with lots of kids obviously have to pay simultaneous attention. And I sympathize with that as a mother of twins. Yeah, but it doesn't seem to be family by family. It seems to be more, well, we think it's more of a community thing. And it makes sense because, like, I may be born into a family where I have one sibling, but I may have 4 children. So I may have cousins around me or not around me. So it's much more, there's many more aspects of how many people are around than just how many you gave birth to or how many your mom gave birth to. So I think there's something to that, but it's not as simple as just controlling for it. Same with Mexican immigrants and Mexican families. And I just think I'll end by telling you what the last 2 facets are. I've already talked with you about facet number 6 because some of the questions led us that direction. That communication and learning by observing and pitching in is based on coordination through shared reference to ongoing activities, collective endeavors. There's a lot of nonverbal conversation as well as verbal conversation. I didn't mention this, but narratives are also important and sort of dramatization. And that contrasts, we talked about that, we'll skip that. There's lots of other things. That contrasts with the limited range of formats that are available if you're in an assembly line instruction situation where you're not involved in the same shared activity. And then, there's some things I'd love to show you there. Then the final one, which we haven't done research on, but I think is super important, is that in learning by observing and pitching in, assessment is to aid the contribution of the learner, and it occurs as the learner is participating. And in assembly line instruction, assessment is to sort learners and test them. So a really different form of assessment. And just to finish out that thought, I think that if we try to get away from assembly line instruction, but we continue to use assessment that fits with assembly line instruction, it draws us right back into assembly line instruction. So the assessment thing, although we haven't done research on, I think that is a super powerful aspect of what keeps us from making changes that most everybody seems to want to make. Yeah.
Really enjoyed your talk. And one thing that I'm thinking about is I'm a credential student and I'll be teaching science when I finish my program. And we talk a lot about the value of a group-worthy task in science education and
Of what kind?
of a group-worthy task, and whether or not an assignment is worthy of multiple members contributing, or if the value of that is the assignment hasn't been created to really require multiple people contributing. And I'm just wondering, like, kind of what your research might say to that, or if that question, like, becomes less relevant, I guess, because I struggle in thinking about teaching about the importance of just learning collaborative skills as an end on their own, and then this tension of a task that really does require multiple people to share different perspectives and different skills to make it happen. So I just am curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, several. My grad student, Omar Rogoff, is looking at children. He's interested in computer science, kids learning computer science, and comparing Mexican heritage and European heritage kids. And he feel strongly that the way that collaborative activities tend to be developed in computer science is not like the kind of collaborative activities that the Mexican heritage kids that he's studying are used to, where you just pitch in and everybody's involved. It's more the teacher designs the activities and says, okay, here's a role for you and here's a role for you, and you be the scribe and you be the whatever. And that's really different. That's still like those moms who were dividing the labor. And it's not like what the Mexican heritage kids experience at home. That's his hypothesis. Another related idea is in the museum world. This is a really important topic. Sally Dwensing, who used to work at the Exploratorium, has written about, she did research in a lot of different countries on the uptake of Exploratorium exhibits. And in some places, the Exploratorium exhibits that are designed for one person, in Brazil, I'm remembering, the whole family's doing it, and they figure out a way to transform it into a group activity. And so you might look for some of her writing, because she talks about generative activities that allow for people to come in different ways according to their interest and their skill.
What was your name?
Dwensing, D-U-E-N-S-I-N-G. And Anne Brown wrote some really good stuff about generative learning as well. I think I'm channeling her today.
I don't want to give people a chance who have to leave at 5:30 to go ahead and leave. But questions can continue if you like.
Great. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I worked in a summer in a hands-on science program in this small village.
Can you hear back there?
In a small village in Ecuador, in the highlands. And I designed the lessons more like an assembly line instruction, but I was very surprised. I worked with 46th graders. And I was a little skeptical, and I was really worried that I had to teach for the whole summer to 40 students. But I was very impressed of how they work in groups. And it's not like I had to say, you'll do this, you'll do that. All of a sudden, they'll sit down, and we were extracting DNA strawberries. And I was very impressed of how well they will collaborate with each other. And now I'm teaching 7th grade or 8th grade. I have experience with that. Now I'm in the same program with my master's in science education. But I'm so comparing how much scaffolding I had to provide to the students in this small village in comparison to the students in here. I feel like the students demand more attention and more scaffolding in here when I'm teaching than in the small village, and even though they have a little prior knowledge about DNA or like some biological processes, which is so interesting that you bring this up, which is, yeah.
There is some literature on, it's a couple decades ago, I think now, on collaborative learning and how important it is for teachers to help kids learn how to do collaborative learning. But many times there's some sort of cooperative learning activity, and they just sort of throw the kids into it. And the kids, if they're middle-class kids, based on this, one would guess they probably haven't had that much experience with how to do it. And I think some of you had to do peer collaborative projects in your undergraduate years and hated them. There's always somebody, and when you're trying to get a collaborative group going, says, I hate them, I can't work with them. Well, people need some help if they haven't got an upbringing or experience with how you collaborate. It sort of underlines the skills that these kids are learning in being part of a collaborative system from day one. But there is some literature on the importance of teaching collaborative skills in the collaborative learning literature. Mm-hmm.
I find it very interesting that Mexican Americans from the more educated family have more of the practices of middle-class European families. Do you think that all their years of schooling is basically creating a different cultural experience for them, so that it undoes previous generations? Maybe their grandmother may not have had schooling, and so all that schooling undoes.
Yeah, the schooling differences here are not differences in the children's schooling, but in their mother's schooling. And if you look at middle-class populations in the United States, middle-class European American populations in the United States, there tends to be a century's worth of generations with 12 years or more of schooling. So it's pervasive in their families. But yes, I think it's a cultural orientation, cultural skills that are part of what they're learning. There are a couple of things that we have found don't have that same pattern. I think everything I told you about does have that pattern with the Mexican heritage kids whose families have a lot of schooling, being like the European heritage kids whose families have a lot of schooling. But in looking at respeto, like that little kid who was asking for help from the research assistant, Mexican heritage kids, no matter what their family schooling, are showing that kind of respeto that that kid did. And in a current study that is just getting finished with Angelica Lopez, no, this is a study with Lucia Alcalá, the Mexican heritage, this is Angelica Lopez's study. Mexican heritage kids whose families have a lot of schooling she's studying children helping without being asked. And in one situation, it's a research assistant showing them how to make solo prints. And there's a lot of scripted in opportunities for helping. The Mexican heritage kids are helping without being asked to the same extent as European heritage kids whose families have a lot of schooling. Both groups whose families have a lot of schooling are similar in helping who we call the solar lady with things that come up during the activity that they're doing. But looking at the same kids at home and the extent to which they help out without being asked at home under their own initiative, those kids Mexican heritage kids whose families have a lot of schooling are acting the same as Mexican heritage kids who we think have more experience with indigenous practices and not much Western schooling. So we're thinking that they have learned that at home you follow the cultural practices of the family across generations. And in an instructional situation, it was in the home and it was not with a teacher, but with a research assistant, but it was an instructional situation. Then they acted like kids from high school families. So the pattern differentiated according to the two activities that they were doing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That sounds really interesting to me because it sort of fits with like what I've experienced in life, because my parents are from Venezuela, but I grew up in the United States, and there are behaviors that you have with family. Like I will kiss strangers if I'm at a family gathering, but you don't do in American culture because that's not what you do. Like if I, went up and hugged and kissed somebody I didn't know, they'd run away screaming, And I wonder if this is similar because, like, you might help without being asked at home because it's not going to bother somebody, but like there is sort of a sense I think sometimes in American culture that like you don't assume that you know what the other person wants.
My kids went to that school that I mentioned in the book We're Learning Together, and we moved away from Salt Lake City, where they'd been in that school, to a school in Santa Cruz. And the first week of school, my son was in 5th grade. He came home and he said, "Mom, I tried to, Josh, or whatever his friend's name was, Josh needed some help with what he was working on today." And I said, "Well, I hope you helped him." And he said, "I did, but the teacher said, 'David, what are you doing? That's my job. Don't do that.'" And so he said, "I learned my lesson. I'm never gonna have some." So it was a really clear lesson in that classroom. And it was a teacher, it was a bilingual teacher who in many ways was a really good teacher, but this was against the rules. So he knew, at the school he'd been in Salt Lake City, of course you help. And in this new school, of course you don't help. So yeah, I think this is really powerful, and so many people are in situations where it's appropriate to learn 2 different sets of rules, or more than 2 different sets of rules. Some know that it's appropriate, some don't. We should probably be better at helping them know what works here and what works there. And I think that's the case for a lot of university students who are the first in their families to go to university. That all those sort of conspiracy things, they haven't had a chance to sort of eavesdrop on professional parents who can sort of help them learn those sorts of things. And so their mentoring is probably especially helpful to help people see, okay, here's the way you go to office hours and you actually get somebody to help you. So learning how to navigate more than one cultural system, yeah, I think is important for everybody. For some people it's crucial, some people already know how, and other people who are like, you know, the stereotype of the ugly American in Europe. They just go bumbling through everything and assuming everybody does things the same way as their upbringing. Those folks don't have a clue that it's even possible to do stuff another way. So, super important topic for us to understand and to make some headway in for our kids and university students as well. Yeah.
I'd just like to confirm your Americans as bumblers. I'm a repatriated American. I lived for 15 years overseas in Europe, as well as India and South Asia. So Americans stuck out like sore thumbs in Europe. But I want to actually, you were intimating this word, but I didn't hear them, the collectivism and individualism. Of course, these are very broad categories.
Yeah.
But I'll specify that. I'll go back to assembly line model of education. That doesn't sound like a very humanistic model or way to go by itself. And then I would add, well, what we have more recently is the business school model of education. And what they have in common is the C word, capitalism. And I want to depoliticize that and use it in terms of Max Weber, you know, and just briefly, the capitalist ethic creates a sense of self that is autonomous, individualistic, all about my goals, personal achievement, success, etc., etc. And that model does not promote collaboration. It does not promote sustainability on a world level. So I think this is like an incredible thing we need to reintroduce to our schools. And in a more personal note, I'm starting to work with juveniles involved with the justice system. And of course, the first red flag is that they drop out of the school system. Well, I want to and of course, the level of misfits, dropouts, and of course, then if they go to prison, then it's scarlet letter for life.
Yeah.
So I want to reframe that. They're not the misfits. They're the canaries in the coal mine. And the coal mine, forgive me, is the educational system. So that's, you can
Cool. Well, there's a couple of things, but the one that I think I want to spend a moment on. No, it's cool. I don't like the dichotomy of individualist collectivist.
It's a continuum, yes. But
well, I don't even like it as a continuum because in San Pedro, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on interdependence, but there's a huge amount of autonomy. So the kids are helping without being asked. They are, under their own steam, getting things accomplished. The kids in San Pedro in the early days were able to run around and go wherever they wanted in little packs of kids, where little kids in the United States were being held always under adult supervision. So I think it's much more complex than a continuum or a dichotomy. There is something to it, but I think that we needed that dichotomy 30 years ago, and now it's time to move beyond the dichotomy and say, okay, we can have interdependence with autonomy, which is what I argue for that we need to open it up to. Still, what you're saying makes sense in terms of what are some of the cultural forces that might create such self-centeredness as what you're describing.
Well, here, it is a dichotomy. If you're grading, if there's 4 people around the table, they're doing a project, you're grading them for, and even just that, the evaluation system needs to be considered. How can you grade 4 people and as a group, and then grade them individually, their personal evaluation? These are 2 different sets here. They're not gradable. It's either or both and. But the point is, you have to put stress to one or the other.
Or there's 3, or maybe there's 4, or maybe there's 5. My objection
separate.
is saying that it's 2 things. I think it could be 3 or 6. But I don't disagree with the idea that those 2 things are not the same thing, that they're separate things. But I just protest the dichotomy. I don't like dichotomies in general. Yeah.
I don't want to keep everyone. Anyway.
Everybody's leaving when they have to.
Okay. So I really appreciate your work. It's
That was just so amazing to hear you talk. So I'm interested in how students learn the practices of science through doing science. And so when you brought that part up with the research apprenticeship, I'm like, okay, that's doing the practices of science. But I also focus on students of color. And so when you were talking at the end about, these white, or not white, you said European-dominated institutions, right? I think about these research apprenticeships, so learning the practices of science in the context, right, of these European institutions. And I didn't know if you had any luck exploring those sort of intersections, or sort of what that means for... I just think it's an interesting intersection, right, of the doing of science, but you're also learning, so what are the norms of the scientific community in these sort of, middle class.
There's several ways to go on that. Mayans, for millennia, have been fantastic scientists.
Right.
But they haven't had the same kind of schooling that we'd characterize as assembly line instruction. So I would separate the doing of science from the way science instruction occurs in an assembly line model. But part of what we were talking about a little bit earlier about people needing to know how to do things more than one way, around the world, assembly line instruction is really common still. And it happens in San Pedro. The kids who are going to have economic possibilities are going to need to know how to operate in that system. So, but they can be helped to learn how. And so I think all of us should become skilled in more than one system. And some of us have to because it's the only way to get a job. And some of us would benefit from it because we'd be more effective in our lives. But we could be helped to learn more than one way. Actually, the book that I wrote, this one of my aims for that book was to help people in a kind of palatable way, an interesting way. I studied creative nonfiction in order to try to write it for a broad audience, for people to begin to see that you can respect more than one way. What I run into often is, in my teaching about culture and human development, is a lot of the European American students, not a lot, some of the European American students feel very challenged if respect is given to some other way of doing things. Because their experience up to then has been that there is one way, and it's the European American way, and they happen to be in the middle of it. Fantastic. But then there's another way that sort of challenges them at first. After a little while, they start seeing it as, they come back to me and say, I have a culture too. But they don't see what they're doing as cultural at the beginning. But they're much better in their lives to know that there are different cultural ways of doing things. They might marry somebody they think they're going to have a wonderful life with, but they come from a cultural background that they don't know how to communicate with each other. It'll help them to know that there's more than one way that's okay. And same for the teaching, for their work, for their neighbors, it's a skill.
I was wondering, with the nonverbal communication, from what I've noticed in traveling is that it's kind of common in a lot of cultures. But I was wondering if we can say that they're the same. I don't know. I would just suspect maybe.
In that study for toddlers, we examined nonverbal communication and explanation and stuff. And the Mayan families used touch, posture, timing, and gesture more and more effectively. The more effectively part is not an empirical finding, but it's really my impression. But they certainly used it more than the European American middle class families. And there's a lot of use of gesture as a means of communication. I don't know if you've been in a situation where you're in a room, somebody needs something, you're in the midst of a meeting or something like that, somebody comes in and they need to tell you that there's a phone call, it's your daughter, blah, blah, blah. So it helps if you can go on with your meeting and the person who's entered the doorway can say, and give you some gesture that means call your daughter when you're done with the meeting. That's really common. in not only in San Pedro, but I've been on the Tonawattam Reservation side happening in Arizona, in Mexico. There's sort of a facility, an articulateness with nonverbal communication, which I think is not common among European American middle class families, or not as common. And it may relate to a long-term use of a sign language as that everybody uses, not just deaf people, in Mesoamerica, where this is according to Eric Foxtree, according to him, for centuries, millennia, it's been the lingua franca for people who move from merchants who are going from one area of Central America to another, entirely different spoken language, but they can use the gestural communication to communicate. Maybe that's one of the sources of the skill with which those little toddlers and mothers were able to communicate without sort of words. That's pure speculation on most parents. But I do think there's important differences in use of nonverbal communication. And it's not just gesture. I should underline that. It's the being able to refer to ongoing events as well. Well, it looks like everybody's had enough, and I appreciate you guys hanging on to the end, and it was interesting conversations with you.
Thank you so much.